Hello everybody, I'm back again for another reading of my novel Walking on Cinders. Hopefully you're still enjoying this story as we go through. We're on chapter 21 this evening, and so here we are. Let's go straight into it, shall we? For days the United Forces waited under the cover provided by the forest, biding their time and recuperating their losses. The men were no longer worried about their reformed counterparts, the enemy that still needed to be wiped out, for they would not dare to venture even into the opening of such a forest. Every soldier knew that those hiding between the trees had the greatest of advantages. Chris, Thomas and Ewan spent those few long days chatting about their own fortunes, musing whether they would come out of this horrible war alive. The days of waiting were tedious and the nights were cold and damp, with little warmth apart from that provided by one central fire on which they cooked their meagre meals. The enemy knew where they were hiding, so there was no fear that the fire might alert them, but even so, their meals were never interesting, as much of their supplies had been left behind. However, on the fourth day, things began to look up. Chris had strung a makeshift hammock between the trunks of two trees, and he was taking advantage of the darkness, recovering his strength by dozing lightly through the afternoon. Beside him at the base of another tree, a tall soldier who carried the company's radio equipment was trying fruitlessly to contact the barracks and call for reinforcements. He had been repeating this process over and over since they had arrived, and yet he was still unable to contact either Dutail or any of his officials. They were fast running out of options. "Mon Dieu!" the soldier exclaimed suddenly in his thick accent, throwing the radio box across the ground. "We are never going to get hold of them." The noise of the object skidding to a halt several feet away was enough to wake Chris from his daze. "Not got it working yet, eh?" he asked sleepily. The man shook his head sadly. "Here, let me try it," he continued, believing that another pair of hands might do the trick. You never know. Hitting the ground might just have knocked some sense into it. It was a simple solution to an ongoing problem. Swinging himself out of the hammock and picking up the radio from where it lay, Chris secured the battery pack and twiddled the various knobs and dials that adorned the front. All at once they were confronted by a hideous sound of static, a crackling and a hissing which sent the birds circling up from the trees. The radio men ran to Chris's side and adjusted the volume before proceeding to type Major General Dutail's believed location into a small electronic screen. It was a fusion of old and new technologies which made this sort of equipment so effective. Within moments the interference died away, and a clear, recognisable voice could be heard over the speakers. "This is French base Charlie Delta Papa. Major General Sir Adam Dutail, hearing you loud and clear, over." The radio man stared as Chris reached for the headset and prepared to respond. The headset sat awkwardly on his head with a microphone that reached down beside his mouth. "Sir," he said loudly, "it's me." There was a slight pause as the message travelled over the distance. "Christopher," Dutail replied gleefully, before his tone turned more grave. "How are you coping?" "Okay, but I'm not sure about the others. We've lost a lot of men in the past few days. It's hit our morale rather hard, and we're hiding out in an area of forest." Chris spoke quickly, for he had no idea who else might be listening in. "Yes, I've heard," Dutail replied after a pause, his voice crackling slightly. "Very bad business, all in mind. I thought you'd have these reformed rebels running, but Chris." "My men are still waiting beyond the furthest hills. They are unaware of what is happening." "Well, that's something," the Major General breathed deeply before continuing. "I must confess, Chris, I've been down to the battleground myself, and I have seen the carnage." By now the radio man was eyeing Chris eagerly, suggesting that it might be time to wind up the conversation. "We need reinforcements, sir," he said quickly. There was a sudden crack, the sound of a twig breaking underfoot, and both soldiers immediately drew their weapons in response. Between the trees they could see something moving. From his strategic position, Chris fired around into the shrubbery and saw a flash of red. Now he knew his target. This time he moved forward and fired again. Behind him, Dutail's voice echoed through the tiny speakers, and Chris realised he had pulled the headset out of the machine as he moved away. "Chris? Chris, can you hear me? I've requested reinforcements by air, over." "Message received, over and out," the radio man replied. He turned off the set and took out the batteries. Whatever was approaching now had escaped, and Chris heard it crashing away from the danger, back to safety. "Well, at least reinforcements are on their way." Chris knew now was the time for action, and hurriedly he began to gather his belongings. Pulling his backpack up over his shoulder, he said, "I never thought to ask your name." The man smiled and realised that he too had forgotten to introduce himself. "Steedwell. Charles Jean Steedwell." Chris nodded, and the men shook hands before walking off together. Their walk was brisk, and soon they arrived once again at the centre of the remaining operation. Chris wasted no time gathering the men into a group. He knew Dutel was sending reinforcements by air, and given the direction of the barracks to the north, and there wasn't a strong wind, they should hear the jets long before they actually arrived. While the men Chris commanded were waiting on the opposite side of the mountain range, he wondered what had happened to Babineau. Where had he gone? Had he disappeared? After deliberating, he realised he really hadn't any choice. He would dispatch Ewan Roberts to meet with his own men and warn them that once the rebels had been destroyed on the front line, the battle would almost immediately transfer to their quarters, meaning they would be the last line of defence. As for Babineau, Chris would take on his role for the present, while Thomas attempted to source further information. It soon became clear that the last man to fight with Babineau had fled from the battlefield. He was a small man of Eastern European descent who had found himself fighting for the United French Army after escaping from his native Russia when reform dictatorships took hold. Babineau had been injured, that much was clear, and if he was alive he would be weak. He could have made his way back towards the barracks and safety, or he might have died. For a moment, Chris was in full command. The airstrike and reinforcements soon arrived, and the second battle began in earnest. Chris positioned his men on the brow of a hill, for when he heard the great machines approaching, he knew that they could negotiate a two-pronged attack. From their position on the edge of the forest, they could see everything that was happening below, and yet were close enough to retreat again if they needed to. The three united jets appeared like great grey birds on the horizon. As they crossed the river, they cast a great shadow on the barren battleground. The largest jet reached the area first, firing a barrage that sent the enemy fleeing into retreat. And days after the previous skirmish, they were still salvaging vital equipment from beyond enemy lines, and now the gun battlements lay open in the field, while packs of ammunition were dropped to the ground as the enemy soldiers rushed for cover of their own trenches. The first round of fire was only strengthened by another, as the second and third plane came in close. Slowly they hovered there above the centre of the field, before one descended towards the ground. This was an Albatros 34, the very latest in military design, and on its soft underbelly it carried a heavily armoured tank, which came to rest on the ground as a group of men clambered down from the cockpit. Now was the time to move, and Chris was the only one who could issue such a command. "Men, descend!" he shouted calmly to those who waited behind. "Thomas with me, and the rest of you regroup behind those armed reinforcements and keep the cover as much as possible." Thomas was soon at his friend's side, and quickly the swarm of united men began to move down towards the battlefield. They hit the ground running, and Chris saw the soldiers who were unhooking the tank from its supports and who would undoubtedly be joining them for the fight. These men were prepared, heavily armoured with grenades and submachine guns, and amongst the faces of the many innocent people, Chris caught a glimpse of one expression he recognised. It was Alan Waldo, a man in his own command who had been kept behind waiting for a call that signalled the need for reinforcements. Well, that call had come from Chris's own lips, and silently he wished the man good luck, as the tank was disconnected from its carrier and the young soldier climbed inside. By now, the aerial bombardment had killed many of the remaining reformed soldiers, meaning that hand-to-hand combat could finally complete Phase 1 of the operation. "We have to destroy those rebels completely this time," Chris shouted over the noise from above. It was unclear as to whether or not anyone heard his plea, but the message at least was clear, for quickly they began to move forwards as a hail of bullets from the sky halted just for a moment. They were crossing enemy lines, jumping down into reformed trenches and beating the enemy at their own game, with a great armoured tank rumbling along in their wake. Chris raised his gun to his waist and shot a man in the chest. He was running towards him and he fell like a rag doll to the ground. The enemy had no idea who they were dealing with, a United commanding officer, perhaps the only one that remained. Beside him, his comrades were locked in a bitter fight with two burly reformed men. For some, close combat out in the field was their only option. Here the enemy was resolute, shooting down several United soldiers, only to be killed themselves by the waiting tank. Chris knew they had won, and he was glad that Ewan had parted from them. It was one less person for him to worry about. He kept Thomas close, covering the man where he could not cover himself. He would keep him alive at any cost. When the reformed men were almost none, Chris climbed out of the trenches and back onto the battlefield. It was sprinkled with the dead. On the far side, close in fact to where they had been fighting days earlier, Chris saw movement. From the dead that lay all around, someone was climbing weakly to their feet. They could not have been injured in the current combat, as they were lying far from the immediate area, so they had obviously been on the battlefield for days. Now, a reformed soldier had seen the man. At the same time, Alan Wardow's head appeared above the parapet of the tank. What was he doing? Taking a chance to view the battlefield from such an angle? Did he recognise the man who was moving? Did he not realise the danger he was putting himself in? Chris moved to the left, fearing above all his own safety. It was unbearable, but as the man who stood up amongst the dead limped towards the mass of United soldiers, Chris recognised his face. It was Babineau, his uniform covered in blood. The single reformed soldier moved slowly towards him, and Chris hoped at that moment that he would shoot and that Babineau would be killed. But instead, something astounding happened. Painfully, Babineau reached down to his belt and pulled a hand pistol from the holster. Then, although his aim seemed nervously off target, he fired 2 shots towards the top parapet of the tank. Chris heard the dull thud as Alan's body hit the metal shell of the armoured vehicle, and he saw the reformed soldier stop dead in his tracks. Babineau was a coward, shooting down his own man to protect himself, pretending that he was in fact one of the enemy. Who would go to such lengths in order to save themselves? Who could be so cruel and heartless? It left Chris with no choice. The reformed soldier turned in confusion as all across the battlefield United men realised they had won the first offensive. Chris ran forward, waving his gun madly. He shot the soldier, and somehow, grateful that he had killed the last one, he stood there. It didn't make up for Babineau's actions, and it wouldn't bring Alan back, but it immediately stemmed his anger. Minutes later, the United soldiers began to regroup, and Babineau had put away his gun and was nearing one of the free fighter planes. He felt physically sick as he saw the officer hauled inside before the plane took off and began a journey that would lead him to safety. So that is chapter 21 of my novel Walking on Cinders. Tomorrow night from 6 p.m. I will read chapter 22, and if you'd like to catch up on any of the chapters you may have missed, they're available on my website and on my YouTube channel. The website you need is atkinsonben.co.uk, and there's a page on there under writing for the Walking on Cinders readings, and my YouTube channel as well. If you search for Walking on Cinders, you'll find the YouTube videos on there as well. I hope you can join me again tomorrow night at 6 p.m.